Ale tylko miałem dużego kebaba, ja miałem średni kebab, to wiesz.
Welcome back to the 21 Convention 2019 of Warsaw, Poland, our fourth event in Europe. Our next speaker is a very close personal friend of mine, a guy who has saved my ass multiple times, and is a veteran speaker of this convention and the first ambassador and elite category speakers we have. He started speaking at this conference back in 2011, a long time ago at this point. He's spoken in Texas, Florida, all over the world with us. More than that, though, he's one of the few speakers still around today who has watched and seen the convention grow since before the first event. He saw me put the first convention together back in 2005, 2006 when this was going on. And he's here today in 2019 in Warsaw, Poland. Without further ado, please help me welcome from manningupsmart.com, Socrates.
Thank you for that. I'd like to also sit down and say this, that I actually owe Anthony Johnson in this convention a very real, sincere appreciation. I would not have the life that I do now, and in particularly the daughter that I have. And it has absolutely been life transformational. And particularly with where we both started out, and that particular journey was a rather unique one. And I think it would be something that a lot of men, it resonates with them, and it'd be a similar journey. I don't want you thinking it's terribly unique, because you can all go through that process if you so and choose. My name is Socrates, and I help people navigate today's sexual marketplace. I help them improve their relationships, and I'm a strong vocal advocate for fatherhood and fathering. Interestingly enough, that has put me in a file of several groups. Feminists, for example, Redpill men, and many of the Redpill thought leaders and content creators loathe me. Why? It's fairly kind of obvious. I fundamentally believe that people are meant for each other, that men and women are naturally compatible and complementary to each other. But because of society, culture, sexual politics, and our sheer ignorance to our own human natural instincts and natural way of being, has taken us seriously, seriously awry. I wanted to do something about that for myself and for others, because I've received so much in kind. Europe, unlike the United States, is completely seeped into world history. It runs deep. Europe has created some of the most wondrous monuments to culture, value, and beliefs. They've survived over centuries, and they're representative of their culture and beliefs and value systems. They're momentous. They speak to God. They speak to our humanity. Today, however, there are movements afoot to debase all this, to attack it, to attack Western civilization, to demean the achievements of Western civilization, to demean the institutions that created, fostered, and supported the world we know today. It doesn't stop. It is not benign. Fortunately, for the most part, these antics are an affront to nearly everyone. And because of it, it's terribly self-defeating. However, the normalization, the mainstreaming of feminism has set Western civilization afire. The institutions that served as the bedrock to our societies, our culture, and our beliefs are under attack. the Judeo-Christian model of morality, which has shaped our ethics and behavioral standards, the base unit of which has always been the family, has consistently come under attack. Unfortunately, members of the Manosphere, in their attempt to repair and restore order to our natural way of being, have unfortunately set the cathedral itself afire, unwittingly, unknowingly, and we need to go through a course correction before we burn it down. I should point out the Cathedral at Notre Dame was not set afire by feminism. It was alight and destroyed by arrogance, reckless management, and carelessness. So too in the Manosphere have those same actions been afoot. Recklessness, carelessness, gross mismanagement of the foundation principles of our imperatives, biological imperatives. We've mismanaged these, we've miscommunicated, we've misshared, we've miscultured and appropriated. And our cultures are suffering accordingly. The result is going to be catastrophic. And it really doesn't matter whether or not, was it feminism or red pill gone awry? Does it really matter when the results are the same? There are those in the Manosphere that rely solely and focus on the intent of a single sex, sexual preferences, and imperatives. These are unjust evaluations. They're unfair. They're unbalanced. And because of it, you have derivative behavior that become deviant. They focus and sow discontent. They merchant in fear and traffic in anxiety. Rollo Tomassi was on a stage very similar to this in October, and he made the proclamation that the greatest threat to the Manosphere will not come from feminism or from outside the Manosphere itself. It will originate internally within the organizations, within our own culture. I happen to believe him. And today, it will be the premise of my entire talk. We have a culture that sits down and notes, hypergamy doesn't care. All women are like that. This is what a gender war looks like. Of course it does. You're calling attention to it. You're not allowing us to find any other means or any other methods. Constantly keeping it on the mind. The focus may be hypergamy, but the message being received is to experience failure in advance without effort. The culmination is the debasement of our human nature to naturally couple, reproduce, raise our children, and relish in our grandchildren. Those aren't benign things. Individually, it's tragic. If it happened to you, or you, or you, it'd be a tragedy. But when it affects all of you, that becomes a societal problem. And that undermines the civilization which we know. It becomes cancerous. And that cancer needs to be eradicated. The red pill community is becoming a cult based on superstitions. It is becoming incredibly credulous. That means it has a willingness to believe things that are beyond reason. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a cult of hypergamy, a cult that focuses in on a single sex, basic, natural sexual imperative. It has a set of beliefs and behavioral patterns and practices associated with it that derive consequences from known situations that are presets that end up in terribly deviant behavior. You absconding from your biological imperative, which is a mandate, not a subset to this. It is also run by a cult of personality. And what do we talk about when we have cults of personality? What do we mean? We mean that there's a deity figure associated with an absolute, an individual that has unquestionable authority, okay, over that particular subject matter, from which all this information and ideology flows. They are ideologically based, and their focused and primary intent is upon that ideological purity. Who's red pill? Who's black pill? Who's blue pill? Who's in? What does it mean to be really red pill? Ideological purity. You also have these individuals cultivating mass media to propagandize themselves, to show themselves in heroic positions. You also have another element in which you have people that are taking sovereignty over the subject matter itself. So let's investigate some of this. When we talk about this sovereignty of the subject matter, who owns hypergamy? Who actually sits down and will honestly, to your face, tell you, I own that word? I've met that individual. That individual has also propagandized himself as a heroic figure. Imagine yourselves calling yourself the godfather of the red pill, the godfather of the Manosphere. I find that intriguing, terribly intriguing. We were joking about it last night. And the reality is, for an individual who does not promote fatherhood, who does not exemplify that himself, who does not want to be shown as an example and promote that, why even have the term father in it? If you're going to do it, drop it. Just call yourself the god of the Manosphere. Has a better ring to it. There's a lot more we can go in on that. I'm going to let this note slide on it. But the bottom line is we do have a cult personality associated with a cult of a belief. Practices, belief values, and behavioral patterns that we expect, none of which are in alignment with your natural biological order. So what does the red pill teach us? Let's go through some ideas. First off, we know that hypergamy doesn't care, right? When mommy's upset, she will burn that house down. Women are ingrained arsonists. Half of marriages end up in divorce. And that, by the way, is a burning half building, half burnt down. You see the ruins of the already smoked out buildings. You see the ones that are on fire. And then the people at the very bottom, nobody wants to live there, do they? And that's the point. Nobody does. We also know that what mommy doesn't burn down, the attorneys and courts, judges, they'll demolish the rest. And by the way, that figure spraying water, he's not to rescue anybody. That's not a firefighter. He's not a first responder. That's a white knight literally pissing on the ruins to keep the dust of this tragedy, this crisis, down to a minimum. That's a demolition crew. We are also left very clearly by the failures that came before us, by the ruins and the wreckage and the scars of our own lives, of what could have been, what should have been. That was my home. My family used to live there. My children slept there. Harsh. For both men and women, loneliness is being peddled, marketed, and sold as a virtue. For women, we have entire societies in which mothers have raised their daughters so poorly that they reject motherhood itself and celebrate their abortions. Picture that. A mother raising their own child so poorly that they reject motherhood and celebrate their abortions. Likewise, we have growing societies of men who are celebrating their own dysfunction and abstaining and detesting relationships, marriages, and families. What will become of this? How soon will we have until fathers are teaching their sons this? It's not enough that we're teaching each other this. Very soon, if not now, we will have fathers teaching their sons this. And what will not persist, what cannot persist, absolutely will not persist. This can't persist. This is a biological aberration. It's a cultural aberration. We know that loneliness develops deep psychological wounds. Stress, anxiety, fear, depression, substance abuse, suicide rates are all the highest amongst those socially isolated. As far as health markers are concerned, it's a carcinogen. It has the same health marker effects as smoking. Simple loneliness. And it is being marketed as a virtue. And the reality is, if it's that hazardous, shouldn't this come with a warning? Shouldn't feminism and deep red pill swallowing come with a warning that sits down and says swallowing this may be hazardous to your health, happiness, and the legacy of your birthright? Hypergamy is no longer the theory that prevents men from making mistakes in their relationship choices. Hypergamy, the theory of it, is no longer there for you to be aware, to understand women, so you can naturally respond to it. It is now shifted or expanded in the dialogue. It has become a theory that prevents men from taking risk inherent in leading and managing families, ensuring their genetic legacy survives. The theory is there to prevent you from even trying. Who are these men? These are dark and damaged men. These are men who are hurt. These are men who were neither loved by their mothers, who had maternal neglect, who were abandoned later, who weren't fully loved, or who maladaptively formed relationships in which they were betrayed and hurt, and justifiably had emotional, visceral reactions to it. These are also men who have not learned and healed through the process. In parlance, they simply have not done the work. They have not looked at the mistakes of their lives and learned the lessons. They avoided doing the hard work, the heavy lifting, the consistent behavior that can supersede these actions. And we know these things can happen, good and bad. These are also men who will take tremendous pride in abusing you for your own good. Listen to the podcast, to the call-ins. How do they treat people who are hurt, who are seeking help, who are reaching out to other men? How do they respond? Ask yourselves, are these people you really want in your life? I'm going to go back to one. One of the lessons of the red pill and what they're selling isn't just fear, anxiety, stress. They package it very, very neatly. And they wrap it up in hypergamy. And hypergamy is awesome because now I have a reason. I can point to something. Hypergamy is at fault. Hypergamy is at blame. It's not what I did. It's hypergamy. The secondary part is hypergamy doesn't care. You now have been relieved of any obligation. Isn't that nice? Massive life failures, and we can point to something outside of you and we can place blame and squarely put it on there. The last bit of it, all women are like that. What does that effectively do? It relieves you from ever trying again. That's red pill magic. That's a lack of maturity. That's a lack of growth. That's a lack of understanding natural, biological, and human order. That's a lack of introspection, understanding. It's a lack of agency, acceptance, self-improvement. If you want to get past this, you have to do the work. You're going to have to look at yourselves, the decisions you made, your life events leading to that moment are going to have to come into scrutiny. We travel in the direction of our most dominant thoughts. Years ago, in 2011, probably a little bit earlier, I was given a book. It's called Psycho-Cybernetics. It's Maxwell Maltz, and at the time it was a very antiquated book. And the premise of it is about visioning. The things you think about, the directions, your visions, naturally will auto-steer you to that goal. It leaves an impression in your mind, and you start looking for it. In many cases, good and bad, and your mind can't tell the difference. So in the book, they focused on the positive natures. If you want success, if you want to succeed, the more clearly you can vision you succeeding, the more likely it is to occur. The behavioral traits that you'll take on will occur that way. If your constant vision is that women are out of control, can't control themselves, and their sexual biological nature is one in which either dominates or acquiesces, that there's a competition between the sexes, that we're not actually compatible, we're competitors. If that is your worldview, what's going to happen? It's very much like driving a car. You ever look off to the side of the road? Where are you going to end up? If you ever look at oncoming traffic thinking, I'm afraid of getting in a head-on collision, and you keep concentrating on it, you're going to run into that truck. Or in parlance, the train wreck that people just don't get over, who never saw it coming. And yes, I'm not belittling the fact. It is true. Women do have a sexual imperative. So do we. But we're only focusing on a single sex, not mutually. We're not also looking at how they have an obligation to control theirs, very much like we have an obligation to control us. But naturally, it is there for us to succeed. It is essential that it is there. It is essential to our evolution that it was there. It is a calling that we need to respond to. My biggest complaint about the red pill, it takes the tremendous, tremendous potential for each of us to be parents, to love our children, and strips us of that. The red pill in many ways is robbing men of their legacy. What's the point of saving a man from suicide if I end up doing it genetically and removing him from the gene pool? What's the point of taking a pistol out of a man's mouth if I allow him to hang himself on his legacy. Short-term thinking. Short-term thinking, short-term success. I honestly think it'd be better appropriate to put the pistol back in his mouth. He won't infect others. He'll be a tragedy. He won't be a mass killer because he will affect others. We imprint. The laws of nature are unyielding, and it simply doesn't care. Any philosophy that puts relationships, marriage, and family anywhere but first in the social orders are inherently wrong. Flat wrong. Wrong as to our human nature, wrong that it is inherently anti-thriving, and wrong in the fact that if it's continuously practiced, it will be self-exterminating. You need to know your purpose. You need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, because that will get you up in the morning. It won't be your debt, it won't be your wife, it won't be your children, but your purpose. And when you have a purpose, you'll do it intuitively, you'll do it naturally, you'll do it gleefully. And in this environment, there are very significant risks. They're legitimate. I've spoken about it in the past, others have as well. And where the risks are steep, you need to be smarter about it. But likewise, where the risks are high, so too are the rewards. Think of it this way. In today's society, in which we have 50% failure rates, in a world in which we think hypergamy reigns supreme, how glorious is it to have a happy, loving household and family that you love and cherish? How rich are you? Ultimately, I believe the sexes are meant for each other. Dirt does not replicate itself. It's a biological fact. You have almost sprung from complete nothingness. Simple, basic molecules, a sperm and an egg, so tiny you can't even see it. And from that, we have a nuclear fusion. A nuclear reaction literally takes place. And we've created life. It's actually miraculous. But we need each other biologically. It's an imperative. It simply cannot be done on its own. Another one is our genetic inheritance. Overall, this picture exemplifies approximately 14 million years of evolution. Holistically, we're probably talking about 3 billion years of evolution. And what we end up having here is this development. How do you look at this history of hominid development and sit down and say, I can't do it? I guarantee you, these guys had a hell of a lot harder than we did. All right? And it's one thing to look at it, but it's also to sit down and say, there's some remarkable things that have happened here. That shift in the curve, something seriously was going on here. Because right now, we just have a gradual evolution. This is brain size over time. It's the body's getting bigger, we're eating more, we're becoming more successful in the environments we're having, but something dramatically changes. It's tool use. We also started collaborative behaviors. All right? We also started using fire. Dramatic uptick. And then we leaned into it. We really started doing some cool things. Early agriculture, herd tracking, all those sort of things. And what you end up with, way at the very top, is Homo sapiens. But you know what's really up there? In all honesty? Pierogies. Buttered dumplings, deep fried. My God. Somebody was getting that shit right. Okay? Somebody knew what they were doing. And because of hypergamy, you're going to tell that whole lineage 500,000 generations of history, of your legacy. You are the living end of it. I can't do it. It's too much. I can't get over myself. I can't get over hypergamy. I'm just not adequate. That's defeatism. These guys also had significant challenges. Human skull on the left, Neanderthal on the right. Human on the right, Neanderthal on the left. That guy on the left, and by the way, that's relative proportional size. That's scaled. That guy on the left, he's a monster. Crazy is we actually overlapped. We weren't always the most dominant apex predator on this planet. We had direct competition, and for several thousand years, that question wasn't answered. And we know it because of the pattern of which we find these individuals, the sequencing. And there were some articles recently written about how they found a first human farther north where they didn't anticipate older than the Neanderthals, which is interesting because it's a territorial thing. We also know that human migration patterns, when we moved out of certain areas, we went into their territory. I can guarantee you there was going to be conflict. Why do we know it's conflict? Because we didn't stay in their territories. In many cases, our migration patterns circumvent theirs. We flank it. We had to. And we evolved. We got better with our tools. We got better with our communications. And in another talk, I talk about the advantages that we had. But ultimately, we had some serious, serious competition. And it was no joke. It was life and death. You want real crazy? Hypergamy was here too. Hypergamy and a bigger, brawnier alpha. But you know what? Somebody in your evolutionary tree, repeatedly, again and again and again, his son and their grandchildren and their grandchildren, they figured that shit out. But you can't. You can read, write, call somebody up, internet. You can't figure it out. They did. Oh, it's not playing. This is unfortunate. We're in Warsaw, Poland, and right here is the Uprising Memorial. Unfortunately, this is a fairly large spread. What we're looking at, over a course of 63 days, 18,000 resistance leader individuals were ended up killed in armed conflict in World War II and with German siege. Close to 180,000 civilians were killed in the same conflict living in this city. And that, by the way, had nothing to do with the Holocaust, which was more than 300,000 people in this very city. A city initially of 1.3 million, that number of people were killed. After the conflict, when they capitulated, the Germans flattened this city. Absolutely flattened it. Building by building, civic structure by civic structure. It is absolutely remarkable. Carpet bombing wasn't enough. Artillery barragements were enough. They actually sent in combat engineers to take down empty buildings to give it as an example to the world. Warsaw was going to be an example. The Polish people were going to be an example. And you know what? They are. The remarkable thing is, after the war, you had their good friends, the Russians, who, by the way, were sitting on the other side of the river while all this was taking place. And they waited for the Germans to do their work so they can come in and have no resistance, and the Polish people wouldn't have their independence. After the conflict, Germans are defeated. It gets even better. The resistance individuals who are still alive are accused of collaboration with the Germans, and they're executed. How do these people get over it? And unfortunately, this video is actually supposed to show a skyscraper just behind this building itself. And it is monumentous. It is unbelievably gorgeous in comparison to what happened here. This is a culture who, after the war, survived socialism and communism. went through all that to then win their independence, to be the city and the state that we know today. How do people do that? It's remarkable. You talk to Poles today about their families, about their culture, and they really don't understand the Manosphere. I was talking to an old man, and he wants to know why an American would fly 5,000 miles to come to Warsaw to talk about men and the Manosphere and our relationships with women, and he doesn't get it. And I understand why, because he lived through that. If you could survive that, women are a cakewalk, and they should be. Right? I'll also ask you this. Why can we look at this and think collectively that we've lost something? Why can we look at this and use this as an analogy of Western civilization, a monument to our ideas, our beliefs, our religions? Why can we look at this and feel like something's lost? But when we look at you as individuals, going through the same thing, going down the same path, we don't have any care to the world. We ignore it. Why can we look at the Manosphere and see this taking place and not recognize it for what it is? We need to do something about this. I go back to this, the original Redpill. It's the idea of Adam and Eve, man and woman, the tree and fruit of knowledge, and either the serpent or a cherub. In this particular case, it's a cherub. And you have to ask yourself, it's not just between man and woman. There's always culture involved. Culture will always play out. We have a choice to be made, all right? And we have to ask ourselves, are we taking a fruit from a poisonous tree? Is that a serpent? Is it benevolent? Is it not? I'll say this too. I don't see skullduggery here, and I don't believe there was. I believe the real story here was one of free will. It wasn't just self-awareness and knowledge between good and evil. I think there was an honest choice being made here. That tree was placed in the middle of the Garden of Eden for a reason. It was to tempt you, to give man the opportunity for free reign, for free choice, for free expression, to knowingly choose each other, to knowingly to defy God, to choose to be with a woman. What a remarkably different story. And fundamentally, I think we need to tell ourselves a different story. And when we tell ourselves a different story, and we look at things objectively, when we put them in the framework of biological imperatives, not just sexual imperatives, and when we can answer those questions collectively within that umbrella of understanding, I think we come up with different results. And when we consciously look for that visioning, we will naturally gravitate towards that. We will naturally have those successes. I'm not saying we aren't going to have failures. I'm not saying we aren't going to be challenging. They are going to be challenging. You are an apex predator of this planet. You're attempting to mate with one of your own kind, another apex predator. She's going to be complicated. So are you. But let's not make this any more difficult than it needs to be. Naturally, we are socialized beings. We're mammals. And that means a degree of socialization that when it's not present, we're seeing maladapted individuals. When children and puppies don't know how to play and frolic, there's something wrong. We know there's something wrong. When adults cannot do the same, we see a lack of conditioning. We see a lack of culturalization. Thomas Sowell writes that an uncultured child rots. I think that's profound. I think it's also true for adults. I think it's true of men. An uncultured man festers. A man who's been hurt, who's been struck by hypergamy, a woman who's been struck by hypergamy, who doesn't do the work, who doesn't objectively reframe, understand, develop, and improve, who doesn't heal, festers. And for men, that's the essence of toxic masculinity. When you take on the viewpoint that one sex must dominate the other or exploit the other, lest it be in the position of being compromised, that is a source of ugliness. A source of ugliness that is dramatically toxic to the individual and to the society in which he roams. And that's being sold. Right now, it's a bestseller. Inherently, we each know the road in which we're on. I implore you, look at your lives. Understand your biological imperatives. Understand your biological imperatives that supersede your sexual imperatives. Develop mastery. Develop intent. Make it art. Make it original. Make it yours. Ultimately, I implore you, choose admirably. Thank you. This, by the way, I have to sit down and say, was an absolute record. I came in under time.
Oh, yeah. Hey, if you don't mind, you can take some questions.
Okay.
Repeat what they say.
Okay, I'll have to repeat. So if we have one at a time, somebody point and I can take Q&A. None? I threw some bombs out there.
You said loneliness is being peddled as a virtue in the Redpill. Would you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the question is, or the statement was that I talk about loneliness as being peddled as a virtue. And it's being peddled as a virtue for both men and women. Feminism in particular is looking at this idea, that women are choosing their careers over family, over connections with loved ones. And I mean even immediate connections. I mean, it is not uncommon, like for example, even myself, I moved away from my family. And so there's a divestment of a family unit. And you suffer accordingly. You also have people who are intentionally making long-term biological decisions, the ability to have children or not, based on these things, based on these virtues, that a career is going to be more fulfilling, that it is more appropriate to actually go to work for a boss than it is to care for your husband, for your family, and for the household, or the family that you actually have, whether there's parents, grandparents, and so forth. And these things are being marketed as a virtue, that these are positive traits, when in reality we know people suffer greatly psychologically, financially, sociologically throughout cause. And we know, for example, you talk about divorce culture as well. Divorce is also promoted highly, in which case we also know that that has been tremendously detrimental to children in particular. It hasn't been particularly beneficial to women either. And we know that it hurts men. But we have a culture that promotes these sort of things, this isolation, this injuring of each other. And it's a replication of injury. And there's, I meant to talk about it in my talk, is that what doesn't get transformed gets transmitted. And when you have this being generated not only with individuals, they will teach that to their children. And so consequently, how hard is it to teach men to be good fathers who've never had a father in their life? And particularly while they're in the act of fathering. In essence, how do you teach a man to father who's been under-fathered while he's in the process of fathering? That's like getting on-demand training, when you're on the job on something terribly, technical and tricky and dynamic. And by the way, a child's going to be very, very responsive. It's incredibly challenging. And we're self-inducing this sort of behavior by the choices we make, by the choices we promote, by the room in which we give latitude for, by the restraints we remove from our institutions. We used to have institutions that used to protect and promote the family, used to safeguard it. I would love to go to a church today in America where I'm an architect, and a lot of times the contractors will have, we've had 102 days injury-free. The next day it'll be 103 days injury-free. That's fantastic. I'd love to see a church do the same thing. We've gone 200 days without a divorce. I mean, that would be impressive. I think I would actually go just to hear that. We're here to support the family, and we frown upon divorce. And we ostracize naturally, which is, by the way, a very human trait. Deviant behavior should be ostracized. We don't do that. We promote it anymore. And in many cases, we talk about loneliness. It's just the icing on the cake. It was just a nice way of saying it, that we're promoting evil. Richard?
Socrates, I want to say bravo. And I don't want to say this with too much hubris, but having been around this for a long time, I mean, you really hit a nerve with me, and I can kind of think it's like red pill maturity, right? And following from the Patriarch convention, which I didn't have the privilege to see. So now for a question. Loving all you said, would you relate it a little bit to MT Gao?
Oh, MGTOW?
Is it kind of the similar thing?
Yeah, and actually the question is about MGTOW, and it's an acronym called Ming Going Their Own Way. And in all honesty, it's a natural offshoot when you actually view life through a red pill lens. Like when you can't trust relationships, when you can't trust women, when hypergamous is so rampant and women are feral, it would make sense, very naturally, to go to a higher biological imperative, which is self-protection, survival. And by the way, that is your primary biological imperative, is to first survive. Your first imperative is survive. Your second's to reproduce. Okay? But when your survival's at stake, okay, because of courts, because of emotional issues, because of your children are going to be stripped from you, because half your assets are going to be seized, and everything else. And by the way, men tend to get ostracized, and divorce impacts them in different ways than women. Okay? It is natural to go into a fight or flight conflict, in conflict. And divorce is fight or flight situation. And the problem with that is there's no amount of assuaging that can take place when your hindbrain goes into that mode. Okay? It's not rational. You're not being rational. You've sunk down to your primordial self, and it is a response mechanism. And I think the rationality of all this is they take this and go, I'm going to protect myself. And there's logic to that. I can understand that. I can be compassionate about that. And what they end up doing is saying, I'm going to remove myself from the dating pool. I don't need women. I don't need this anymore. Okay? I can do a number of other things. I can navigate the world, but not be committed, not to have families, not to do the following things, not to engage in these kind of relationship-centric behaviors. And for some men, I understand why they do it. Okay? Men have a wall too. We talk about women hitting a wall. Men do too. Nobody wants to talk about that. There's a point in time in your life you shouldn't be having children. You can. Nature doesn't like it, and you know nature doesn't like it because of the birth defects associated with it, the health risks associated with your children. All right? We sit down and see that, but so they take this notion of a rational response and they move it forward. And they guise themselves on it. And very much in the same way I talked about in the presentation, hypergamy doesn't care. You can point to it. There's a rationality. Not only that, all women are like that, therefore I don't have a justificational reason for actually trying. The problem is very much like in architecture, if I had my production and design team come to me and say, hey, here's a set of plans, this is the concept and the design challenges we're facing, we're trying to solve the following problem, and this is our solution. And I could look at it and I could say, great attempt, I understand what you're doing here, tell me about this, let's look at this, but the solution doesn't meet the overall objective, which is the biological one of reproducing, of having families, of furthering the species, which is absolutely critical. You have to, otherwise we go extinct. And if we do it individually, that's not a problem, that's an outlier. But when we start doing it in mass, when we become lemmings, when it's affecting our nations because of the birth orders, the birth rates, we've got a real problem. When you have politicians saying, we have to take people from other countries and move them into ours for replacement levels because we failed to recognize the value of our own culture, having children, and developing our own citizens with national identities. There's a problem there. There's a real problem there. And we're seeing that now. This is sexual politics. All right? And MGTOW is promoting this by default. And the net result is going to be the same. Whether it's feminism burning the house down, or the Manosphere, including MGTOW. Civilization will collapse, and what cannot endure won't endure. No.
You mentioned Redpill is starting to turn into a cult. Of course, that's not the original intention of Redpill. Was about seeing the truth for what it is.
Correct.
But I agree with you very much about it turning towards a cult. You know, isolating people, focus on negative emotions, a focus on doctrine, and a structure of unflexible beliefs that can't adapt to reality. But that's exactly how feminism started, and I think we're maybe seeing a kind of cuttlefish strategy amongst certain people in the manosphere, where they don't necessarily they're not there necessarily for the benefit of other men, but for their own benefit, while pretending to be something they're not. And I think it's very important that men understand how to avoid those kind of people, not just one of them or two of them or a group, but avoid that entire problem to begin with, because it's going to come up again.
Yes, yes. And there is a profit incentive, and I know that some people are incentivized by that, and fear sells and sex sells, and when you have the two together, man, you are selling hotcakes on a cold day. And I will sit down and say I think there's a profit incentive, but I'll be fair, because I know a lot of these individuals, or some of them. I don't think that was the sole reason. I think in many ways that they were hurt and they haven't gotten over it. I think it's their own personality types, and I think that in many ways it's a dialogue that we're not able to have because of personality types involved as well. You know, when we talk about a cult of personality, you can't question certain authorities without it being an attack. You can't bring up questions within an open forum without their followers attacking mindlessly, and we see a lot of that. And so I say that the Manosphere is becoming a cult. I would say a portion of it. You're seeing a division, you're seeing a separation of it. I'll also say this too, with the personality types, and we talk about it's being very feminist-like. I'll say it even goes further than feminism. I say feminism as far as a philosophy. I'll say it's very feminist, that it actually has mothering qualities to it. Think about that one. You have grown men who are not cultivating men. They're mothering them. What does a mother do? It nurtures. It tells you you're okay the way you are. You're right. You don't need to change. You don't need to grow. You don't need to develop. Come here. Come over here and suckle on the red pill tit. Okay? It's mothering. Suckle on the red pill tit. Okay, and what happens when a mother does this? When a young boy does not have access to a father? He doesn't develop. Right? And we're seeing that in men today with a lot of the red pill awareness, red pill wisdom taking place, is that they're being mothered, they're not being cultured. And this element of will culture you through abuse. No, you're just replicating your own abuse. And some people actually enjoy it. You know, you can always tell the shit posters and the guys who love snark, and I particularly hate it. I've grown to really hate it. Initially I thought it was kind of funny, humorous, but the reality is snark is negative. It's always tearing down. Snark never builds. Snark never creates. It goes out to destroy, and it seeks it. And what you don't want is to have in your company a destroyer, okay? Because it will turn on you for nothing more than humor and pleasure. And we're seeing that play out as well. And unfortunately, social media is ripe with this. Absolutely ripe with this. But I think that there is this movement of mothering men rather than cultivating them. And we cultivate not through abuse. We cultivate through empathy, understanding, through camaraderie, to shared experiences and failures. We do it through humor. We do it by holding each other accountable without attacking, without demeaning, without humiliating. And I'm serious when you listen to some of these podcasts. Here are people calling in with no other source for help, or very little, and being verbally abused. And they're profiting off that. And they take pride in it. And they'll tell you. I find that absolutely stunning. It's reprehensible.
So what would be a strategy going forward? Kind of like going back to like simply regarding the red pill as a theory, and then carving out the path with a different end in mind?
Yeah. Hypergamy is real. It is a sexual imperative for women. Men have a sexual imperative as well. Okay, and in many cases you can say they're kind of at odds. Okay, a woman wants to secure resources with a particular provider. A man wants kind of unlimited resources with a wide variety of women and tend to be young and variety. Okay, so how do you get that to work? And so the challenge is, as a man, I need to understand hypergamy and what it wants, and then I need to rise up and meet that as a challenge. Okay, women have the same obligation. They have to understand a man's hypogamous nature and answer it. And by the way, when you do, something really marvelously happens. It's truly kind of biblical. You respond with each other. And what happens is you end up thriving. You don't just exist, you thrive. You're with a woman who understands, who can care for you, who can nurture you, who satisfies you. You know, we were talking with George Bruno, and there was something I said years back that resonated with him. When a woman makes you a sandwich, it fills your stomach. But in the process of making you that sandwich, she feeds your soul. Okay? That sandwich will satisfy you that afternoon. But what she fed you, well, you will carry that for weeks. Okay? And there's something tremendously powerful in doing that. So hypergamy is a calling. It's not something to be feared. You have to watch it. You have to pay attention to it. Same thing with men. Unchecked hypergamy has wreaked havoc across the centuries, across every institution and every culture and civilization we've had. Okay, and usually what you end up with is a stratification of elite that sexually monopolizes women and resources to the detriment to the greater population group. And every civilization has had that. And the way in which we know it, you look at harem context. Every culture's had harems one way or another. And typically it's not only within their own culture, we go into war because we don't want to alienate our own. We have to go out and get more. And you'll see that taking place. So we know that unchecked hypergamy, patriarchy, unchecked, can be a detrimental element. We know unchecked hypergamy can be the same thing. The problem is that it plays out typically different. And there's, unfortunately, anthropological evidence that they don't typically succeed. They're not particularly successful. And there's kind of a red pill joke that they've risen to the level of mud huts, and that's as far as they get before they collapse. And that's historically true as well. So I think we need to understand our nature, our human nature, respond accordingly. We have to understand our society and context in which we live. I think being in the U.S. is going to be dramatically different than Poland. You know, we can see that. But you have to learn to adapt to both, that personal context, that human context. And ultimately what you end up with is that at the end of the day, it's not that you have to respond to every woman. You end up focusing in on one. And it's not that you focus in on one, you find one that shares your purpose. When I sat down and said you need to know your purpose, you need to partner with somebody that has the same purpose. Because if you don't, you're going to be pulling in opposite directions. You're just going to be a constant fight and trouble. You know, and I think in biblical studies they talk about being mutually yoked. You know, workhorses, two workhorses paired together, yoked together, going in the same direction with the same purpose. You'll actually create and do a tremendous amount. You'll accomplish a great deal together. And so we look at those sort of analogies. And so I think it would be terribly important when we vet women is that we make sure that our purposes aren't in alignment. Because when they're not, the reason why we're together has actually fallen apart. And it's probably a good opportunity to sit down and divest at that point, is when that time and reason has expired. So is the relationship. Either it gets renegotiated, transformed, or the departure is appropriate.
So I'm trying to understand the idea of fatherhood, because you kind of like, the way I see it, you put it on two different corners. On one corner would be loneliness, which men are hurt, don't want to take responsibility. And on the other side is the fatherhood, is looking at our biology, looking at our evolution, looking at our lives as men. And I'm trying to get more notions and put them together to the fatherhood to create certain, like a solid idea of like how that ideally would look like. Is there anything you could add?
Yeah, fatherhood isn't going to be perfect for everybody, and throwing people into fatherhood before they're ready is going to be a nightmare. But I'll also say this as a relatively new father myself, you are never going to be ready for fatherhood. You just aren't. And I don't mean the daily tasks. You can learn the daily tasks. The consequential nature of it, that your job as a father is to raise a human being, to bring a child. And to give you an idea, my daughter's 3.5, and she's just now starting to become human. You know, she was a human baby, but she's now having to start to have traits that animals don't have. She can project forward. She's starting to think abstractly. And so our job is to develop and raise an individual through that whole maturation process to the point that they're a fully functional social being. Okay? And if you do that appropriately, the continuation of that is simply natural. You'll actually go out and find somebody, they'll couple, and you know couples are doing it right, you know, and communities are doing it right when they don't understand this. We have a speaker here that comes here on a regular basis, Tanner Guzzi. When I first came and I was talking about some of the stuff and having to reconstitute a culture, because if you don't come from a culture that has that, you need to create one yourself, or you're going to be at a deficit for it. And he's taking notes as I'm talking, going, yep, his culture provides that. Yep, my culture provides that. Yep, my culture provides that. And so he doesn't understand that. And I don't say he doesn't understand. I think there was awareness generated that some of us are facing different cultural situations than he does. And so what happens is when he's having situations in his culture, they don't have these problems because everyone's cultured and developed in the same way, and they're acting and formulated appropriately. And when things are done appropriately, things work. A car that's been developed and designed, engineered, maintained, when you put the key in it and turn it, it goes on. Actually, you don't even have to put the key in it anymore. You just turn the thing on. It works. And people should be the same way. And we've kind of forgotten a lot of this stuff. And where we go astray, we have to then recorrect. And so there's a correction process. And I think that's healthy. You know, and by the way, I don't think that there should be any one school of thought either. I think like a lot of religions, or let me take that one out because that might be a little touchy. Let's talk architecture because I'm an architect. That there are different philosophies of architecture. There's this particular school, or this particular school, or this particular school. And when I was going through the programs that I was going through, the question is well, what's right, what's wrong? And the response was, if you want to know what it's like to be a Buddhist, be a Buddhist. Okay, wear the garments, wear the clothes. If you want to know what it's like to be a modernist, be a modernist for a while. If you want to know what it's like to be a classical revivalism, go do that, embrace that. And so I think there's a lot of advice that the Manosphere is now starting to develop, and as we kind of progress from, you know, Redpill 101, which by the way, we talk about Redpill just repeating itself. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just wash, rinse, repeat, wash, rinse, repeat, wash, rinse, repeat. And after a while, it's the same information again and again and again. And I think we're seeing an emergence from that. And from that, I think it'll be also very clear that we'll start having different philosophical ideas of how things should be, or advisors, or, you know, when we talk about gurus or individuals that are content creators and thought leaders. I think it'll be appropriate to try different things that you like, and very much like your personal style, understand your natural archetype, who you're responding to and why, and dress accordingly. You know, and that goes back to Tanner Guzzi. And if you want to actually see a really interesting presentation, watch his presentation, not on personal style, on clothing, but instead of style of clothing, make it style of philosophy, of relationship advice, those sort of things, and see how those transferable ideas can actually resonate for you. And I think it's going to, his viewpoint on how style and masculinity are blended together, I think are absolutely outstanding. He's one for one, he's an outstanding speaker and just an awesome guy, and can't recommend those talks enough. And I think it's a great analogy to hold, is to sit down and say, understand your archetype, and then dress accordingly. Are we out on time? Cool. Give it up one more time to Socrates. Thanks, guys.
Sam tylko biorę dużego kebaba, ja miałem średni kebab, wiesz.